In a world carved from dust and desperation, a man's worth was measured by the land he could tame. Johnny Stone was a man of vast, empty lands and an even emptier heart. For a single silver dollar, he bought himself company a silent, deaf girl with eyes that held the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken words. He offered her shelter, a roof over her head, in exchange for a quiet presence. But the loudest sound on the unforgiving prairie wasn't the wind, the coyotes, or the crack of thunder. It was the earth-shattering secret she kept locked behind her silent lips. The year was 1888, and the Montana Territory air was thick with the kind of heat that baked the very hope out of a man. It shimmered over the plains, turning the distant Bear Paw Mountains into wavering apparitions. For Johnny Stone, the heat was just another layer of the silence that had become his life. His ranch, a sprawling and lonely kingdom of cattle and dust, was a testament to his hard work. But the sprawling 2-story house he'd built with his own hands echoed with a hollowness that no amount of success could fill. Johnny was a man, shaped by the land he worked, rugged, weathered, and economical with his words. His face was a road map of squint lines from staring into the sun, his hands calloused and scarred from rope burns and splintered wood. He was respected in the nearest town of Redemption, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings 20 miles away, but he was not known. He kept to himself, his only companions, the herd and the ghost of a wife taken by fever 5 winters past. It was on his monthly trip to Redemption for supplies that he saw her. He was tying his horse Titan to the hitching post outside the general store when the commotion spilled out of the saloon next door. Silas Blackwood, a man who had long ago traded his dignity for the bottle, was thrown through the bat-wing doors, landing in a heap in the dusty street. "And don't come back till you can pay your tab, you worthless sot," the bartender bellowed from the doorway. Silas, grizzled and reeking of cheap whiskey, staggered to his feet. Behind him, cowering in the shadows of the saloon's porch, was a slip of a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her dress was a faded calico that hung on her thin frame, her face smudged with dirt, and her pale blonde hair was a tangled mess. But it was her eyes that caught Johnny's attention. They were a startling clear blue, yet they seemed utterly vacant, fixed on some distant point beyond the squalor of her reality. She didn't flinch at the shouting, didn't react to her father's fall. "I'll get you your money, Jacobson," Silas slurred, spitting into the dust. He then turned and grabbed the girl's arm with a cruel twist. I've got assets." He dragged her forward into the harsh sunlight. "Look at her strong back. Can cook, can clean. Won't give you no lip neither. She's deaf as a post. Been that way since she was a babe." A few townsfolk had stopped to watch the pathetic spectacle. They shook their heads with a mixture of pity and disgust, but no one intervened. The Blackwoods' misery was a long-standing feature of Redemption. Johnny felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He'd seen men trade horses, cattle, even land. He'd never seen a man try to trade his own daughter. "What do you want for her, Silas?" a cruel voice called out. It was a grimy-looking prospector with a yellow-toothed grin. "A bottle of your finest rotgut." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. The girl's expression remained unchanged, her eyes still distant. It was as if she had built a wall of silence around herself that nothing could penetrate. Silas's desperation festered into a grotesque sales pitch. "She's a good worker. You won't even know she's there." Quietest help a man could ask for. He shook her, and for the first time, a flicker of something fear perhaps crossed her face before the emptiness returned. Johnny found his feet moving before his mind had given the command. He stepped between Silas and the prospector, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the drunken man. Johnny didn't say a word. He just stared down at Silas, his grey eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. "What do you want, Stone?" Silas sneered, trying to muster some bravado. "Come to watch the show." Johnny reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a single heavy silver dollar. The eagle on its face was worn smooth from years of use. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, the metal glinting in the sun. $1. Johnny said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Silas blinked his liquor-addled brain, struggling to comprehend. $1 for what?" "For her," Johnny said, nodding his head slightly toward the girl. "You sell her contract of indenture. I'll pay her debt. $1 and she comes with me. You don't bother her again. Ever." The crowd went silent. This was different. This wasn't a joke or a drunken barter anymore. This was a transaction. Silas stared at the coin, his eyes wide and greedy. $1 could buy him several bottles. It could buy him a few days of oblivion. He looked at his daughter, his face showing no trace of fatherly affection, only calculation. To him, she was a burden, a useless, silent mouth to feed. "Done!" Silas spat his hand, darting out to snatch the coin. Johnny closed his fist around it. "We do this proper. At the marshal's office. You sign the paper, a legal indenture, so you can't come crawling back." Marshal Thompson, a weary man who had seen too much of the territory's ugliness, looked on with profound disapproval, but knew he was powerless to stop it. A contract of indenture, while distasteful, was legal. He drew up the simple document. Silas Blackwood, in exchange for $1 silver, paid to settle his debts, relinquished all guardianship of his daughter Aria Blackwood to Johnny Stone. Silas scrawled his name with a shaky hand. Johnny signed his with a firm, decisive stroke. The deed was done. Johnny looked at the girl Aria. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. He gently touched her elbow. She flinched violently, her eyes finally focusing on him, wide with animal terror. Johnny immediately pulled his hand back. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. He then pointed to himself, then to his wagon, loaded with supplies, and then made a motion of traveling. She watched his hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. He repeated the gesture, moving slowly, deliberately. A flicker of understanding seemed to dawn in her eyes. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. As Silas stumbled back toward the saloon with his dollar already shouting for a bottle, Johnny led Aria to his wagon. He helped her up onto the seat, his touch as brief and impersonal as possible. She sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead at the long, dusty road that led to his ranch. As the wagon rumbled out of Redemption, Johnny glanced at the silent figure beside him. He had just spent $1, not on a farmhand, but on a person. He didn't know the first thing about her, not even the sound of her name on his own lips. He had bought a deaf girl from her drunk father for the price of a cheap drink. He told himself it was an act of pity, a rescue from a wretched fate. But as he drove into the vast, lonely expanse of his own life, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had just bought something he didn't understand at all, and that the silence in his home was about to change forever. The journey to the Stone Ranch was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves, and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Aria sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if by not looking at Johnny, she could pretend this wasn't happening. Johnny, for his part, felt a profound and uncomfortable awkwardness. He was a man of action, not words, but now even actions seemed fraught with the potential for misunderstanding. When they finally arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The ranch house stood sturdy and proud against the backdrop, a two-story structure of dark, weathered pine. It was a fine house, built to last, but from the outside it looked as quiet and solemn as its owner. Johnny halted the wagon and climbed down. He walked around to Aria's side, but hesitated to offer a hand. Instead, he simply stood back and gestured for her to get down. She did so with a practiced quickness, landing lightly on her feet and immediately looking around, taking in the corrals, the barn, and the endless expanse of land. Her eyes, Johnny noticed, were constantly moving, scanning, assessing. It was the look of someone who had learned to survive by being aware of everything. He led her into the house. Inside, it was clean and orderly but starkly masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by a simple wooden table, 2 chairs and a worn leather armchair. A rifle was mounted above the mantel. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. Johnny realized she was still standing just inside the doorway, clutching a small burlap bundle he hadn't noticed before, presumably all her worldly possessions. He knew he had to establish some way to communicate. He pointed to the table then, mimed eating. Her eyes followed his motions, and she gave another one of her small, hesitant nods. That first evening was a pantomime of clumsy gestures. He showed her the water pump, the kitchen, and the small room upstairs that would be hers. It had been his wife Sarah's sewing room. It was small, with a single window overlooking the eastern plains, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt and a small wooden chest. When he gestured that this was her room, her eyes widened for a moment, and she clutched her burlap sack a little tighter. It was likely the first time she'd ever had a space to call her own. For the next few weeks they fell into a strange, silent routine. Johnny would rise before dawn, and by the time he came in from his first round of chores, she would have coffee brewing and a simple breakfast of bacon and bread on the table. She was a tireless worker. She cleaned the house with a quiet efficiency, mended his clothes with neat, small stitches, and tended a small vegetable garden she started near the porch. She moved like a phantom, always present, but never underfoot. Johnny found himself watching her. He noticed the way she'd pause while sweeping to watch a hawk circle in the sky, or how she would gently touch the leaves of the tomato plants, as if checking on old friends. There was a grace to her movements that belied the harshness of her past. Communication remained a barrier. He would point and gesture, and she would watch his face and hands with an intense focus, usually understanding his meaning. But anything complex was impossible. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, staring at a newborn calf. There was a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before. He wanted to tell her its mother was a first-timer, and he was worried she might reject it. But he had no way to form the words. The frustration was a physical weight in his chest. That night, an idea took hold. He remembered a book Sarah had owned, one she'd ordered from a catalogue back east. It was about teaching the deaf, filled with pictures of hands forming letters and words. After an hour of searching in an old trunk, he found it. The pages were yellowed, but the diagrams were clear. The next evening, after their silent dinner, he laid the book on the table between them. He opened it to the alphabet page. He tapped the letter A, then formed the shape with his own large, clumsy hand. He looked at her. Aria stared at the book, then at his hand. Her face was a mask of confusion. Johnny tried again. He pointed to an apple in the fruit bowl, then made the sign for A again. He repeated it several times. Slowly, tentatively, she mimicked the shape with her slender fingers. Her first attempt was shaky, but she tried again, her brow furrowed in concentration until her hand matched the drawing in the book. A slow smile spread across Johnny's face, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. He pointed to the sign she'd made and nodded enthusiastically, A faint blush rose on her cheeks, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth twitched upward in a shy, fleeting smile of her own. It was a beginning. Every evening they sat at the table, the lantern casting a warm glow on their hands as they worked their way through the alphabet, and then to simple words: water, horse, food, home. He would point to an object, and they would spell it out with their fingers. It was a slow, painstaking process, but it was a bridge across the silence that separated them. Johnny discovered she was incredibly bright. She learned quickly, her mind a sponge for this new language. She began to talk to him, with her hands asking simple questions. Sky blue why, horse sleep stand. He in turn began to see her not as the deaf girl he'd bought, but as Arya, a woman with a quick mind and a gentle spirit. He found himself looking forward to their evening lessons, to the quiet communication that was more intimate than any spoken conversation he'd had in years. The house no longer felt empty. It was filled with a new kind of sound, the soft rustle of turning pages and the silent dance of hands telling stories in the lamplight. One day he came in from the fields, exhausted and bleeding from a gash on his forearm where he'd been kicked by a stubborn mule. Arya saw it at once. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she rushed to the pump, returning with a basin of water and clean rags. As she gently cleaned the wound, her touch was feather-light. He watched her face, etched with concern, and felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the summer heat. She finished wrapping his arm, then looked him in the eye. With her hands, she carefully spelled out a new word, one they hadn't practiced. H-U. He shook his head and managed a small smile. With his good hand, he spelled back, no. T-H-A-N-K-Y-O-U. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on his face. In that moment, the silence between them was not an emptiness, but a space filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his ward. They were two lonely people on a vast prairie, learning to speak the same language. But Johnny was still blind to the true nature of her silence, a secret held so deep it was a part of her very bones. Summer bled into autumn. The greens of the prairie faded to gold and ochre, and a crispness entered the evening air. The routine on the stone ranch had settled into a comfortable rhythm, a silent ballet of shared chores and quiet companionship. Their nightly sign language lessons had progressed from single words to simple sentences. Arya's hands, once hesitant, now moved with a fluid grace, her expressions adding a depth and emotion that spoken words sometimes lacked. Johnny learned about her through the stories she told with her fingers. He learned she loved the color of the sky just before sunrise. He learned she was afraid of lightning. He learned she had a knack for knowing when a cow was about to calve. She was opening up to him like a desert flower after a rare rain, and Johnny found his own hardened heart softening in response. The ranch felt more like a home than it had in 5 years. He had completely accepted her deafness. It was a simple, immutable fact of their life together. He'd become so accustomed to communicating through sight and touch that he no longer even thought about sound. He warned her of a spooked horse by stamping his foot on the porch to create a vibration she could feel. He got her attention by waving his hand or lightly touching her shoulder. Her world was silent, and he had learned to live in it with her. The incident happened on a bright, deceptively placid afternoon in late September. Johnny was repairing a section of fence on the southern edge of his property, a good mile from the house. Arya had brought him his lunch earlier, a small pail with bread and jerky, and was now back at the house, likely tending to her garden. The air was still, the only sound the metallic snip of his wire cutters and the buzzing of insects. He was hunched over, wrestling a stubborn piece of barbed wire into place, his focus entirely on the task at hand. His back was to the path leading from the house. He didn't see the snake. It was a prairie rattlesnake, thick as his wrist and the color of the dry earth, coiled in the shade of a sagebrush, not 5 feet from where he worked. It had been sunning itself, placid and still. But his movements had disturbed it. The first warning was the sound, a dry, chilling buzz that sliced through the afternoon, quiet like a blade. The sound a deaf person could never hear. Johnny froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He knew that sound intimately. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes scanning the ground around him. He spotted it. The snake was coiled its head, raised its tail, a blur of vibrating scales. It was poised to strike. He was too close to run, too awkwardly positioned to draw his pistol without provoking it. His mind raced, but one thought, sharp and panicked, cut through the rest. Arya. He had seen her earlier, walking back toward the house, along this very path. Had she gone inside? Or had she decided to gather wild herbs nearby? Was she walking back now, oblivious, about to step right into this danger? Pure primal instinct took over. He forgot about her deafness. He forgot about their silent language. He forgot everything except the desperate need to warn her, to protect her. He filled his lungs and roared her name, a raw, desperate sound torn from his throat. "Arya, get back, snake!" The sound ripped across the silent prairie. It was the loudest thing he had heard in months, his own voice sounding foreign and jarring. And then the impossible happened. From the direction of the house about 50 yards away, down the path, he heard a sharp, terrified gasp. His head snapped up. There she was. Arya. She had been walking towards him carrying a basket, but she was no longer walking. She was frozen, mid-stride, one hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide, with a terror that was sharp, immediate and unmistakable. Her gaze wasn't on him. It was locked on the ground near his feet. She had heard him. She had heard the warning, and she was looking for the danger. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The buzzing of the snake, the heat of the sun, the pounding of his own heart, it all faded away. The only thing that existed was the look on Arya's face. It was not the confused look of someone startled by a vibration. It was the face of someone who had understood a spoken word. The snake, agitated by his shout, lunged. Johnny reacted on pure reflex, throwing himself backward away from the striking fangs. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs. The snake struck the spot where his leg had been a second before its fangs, hitting nothing but dust. Before it could recoil for a second strike, the loud crack of a rifle shot echoed across the plain. The snake's head exploded in a spray of dust and blood. Johnny scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up. Arya was standing there, his rifle, the one that always hung over the fireplace, in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. She was an exceptional shot. He'd taught her himself, setting up cans on a fence post. He'd believed it was a necessary skill for a woman, alone on a ranch, deafness or not. He just never imagined she would use it like this. He stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process two contradictory truths. The girl he knew to be deaf had just responded to his shout. The silent, fragile creature he had rescued had just saved his life with deadly precision. The rifle slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the ground. Her face was ashen, her blue eyes wide with a new kind of fear, a fear that had nothing to do with the dead snake at his feet. She looked at him, and he saw the carefully constructed wall of silence she had lived behind crumble into dust. He took a step toward her. "Arya." He said, his voice barely a whisper. She flinched as if he had struck her. She didn't look at his hands to see what he was signing. She looked at his lips. The secret was out. It lay between them, more venomous, and far more dangerous than the dead rattler in the dust. The silence that had defined their lives was a lie. Arya opened her mouth, and a choked, hoarse sound came out, the sound of a voice unused to speaking. "Johnny!" She breathed, her voice raspy and trembling. I can hear." The walk back to the ranch house was the longest of Johnny's life. The silence that fell between them now was a different beast entirely from the one he had grown accustomed to. Before, it had been a space of quiet understanding. Now it was a chasm of questions, betrayal and confusion, thick with the weight of Arya's spoken words. Johnny carried his rifle, his knuckles white. Arya walked a few paces behind him. Her head bowed, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. The dead snake lay forgotten in the dust. A much larger poison had just been revealed. Inside the house, the familiar, comforting space felt alien. Johnny leaned the rifle against the wall by the door and turned to face her. He didn't know what to feel. Relief that his life had been saved, anger at the deception, a profound, aching confusion. All of it churned in his gut like a storm. "All this time," he said, his voice low and strained. "The book, the signs, all of it." Arya wouldn't meet his eyes. She stood in the middle of the room, looking small and fragile, yet the secret she had carried made her seem like a stranger. Tears welled in her eyes and began to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Why?" Johnny demanded, his voice rising despite his efforts to control it. "Why the lie, Arya?" She finally looked up, her blue eyes swimming with a misery so deep it momentarily stunned him into silence. Her voice, when she spoke again, was rough and cracked from disuse, like a rusty hinge being forced open. "It started when I was a child," she whispered. "My mother was sick for a long time before she passed. She couldn't bring herself to say, my father, started drinking heavily then. When she was gone, it got worse. So much worse." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if a cold wind only she could feel was blowing through the room. He would come home in a rage, shouting, breaking things, and he would hit me for any reason. A dish I dropped, supper not being hot enough, but the worst was when I would cry. The sound of my crying drove him mad. He would scream, "Be quiet, just be quiet." It was the sound that angered him. Johnny's own anger began to curdle into a sick feeling of dread. He motioned for her to sit at the table, the same table where they had practiced their silent alphabet. He sat opposite her, his hands flat on the wooden surface. "One night," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength as the dam of her silence broke. "He was worse than ever. He'd lost his week's pay in a card game. He came at me, and I was so scared I didn't make a sound. I just froze. I didn't cry, didn't scream, and he stopped. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a long time. He grunted and said, 'Dumb as a post, just like your mother.' And then he just left me alone. He went to sleep." She took a shuddering breath. "It was a revelation. Silence was safety. If I couldn't hear him, I couldn't disobey him. If I couldn't speak, I couldn't talk back. If I didn't react to his shouting, he grew bored of it faster. So I started pretending. At first it was just when he was drunk. Then it became all the time. It was easier. The townspeople pitied me. They called me poor deaf Arya. No one expected anything from me. No one tried to talk to me. I became invisible. and invisible was safe. The pieces clicked into place for Johnny with horrifying clarity. The vacant expression, the lack of reaction. It wasn't deafness, it was a shield, a desperate, brilliant, and heartbreaking survival tactic forged in the fire of abuse. When you bought me," she said the words catching in her throat, "I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep pretending. I didn't know you. I didn't know if you were like him. The silence was the only armor I had." "But here," Johnny said, his voice softer now, "I never laid a hand on you. I tried to be." He trailed off, unable to put words to what he'd tried to be. "I know," she whispered, and a single tear dropped onto the tabletop. "You were kind. Kinder than anyone has ever been. You taught me the signs. You smiled at me. And every day the lie felt heavier. Every time you patiently showed me a new sign, my heart broke a little more. I wanted to tell you. I was so afraid of what you would do if you knew. I thought you would be angry that you would cast me out." And he had been angry. The shame of his initial reaction washed over him. He had seen it as a betrayal against him, not as the desperate act of a terrified young woman. "The snake," he murmured, remembering the moment. "I was walking back," she explained, "and I heard you shout. My name. No one has shouted my name in kindness ever. It was always a curse from his lips. But you shouted it to save me. I didn't even think. I just ran and got the rifle." The room fell quiet again, but the chasm was gone. In its place was a fragile, trembling bridge of truth. Johnny looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the deaf girl or the liar, but Arya Blackwood, a survivor of unimaginable cruelty who had used her wits to stay alive. The strength it must have taken to maintain that facade for years. It was staggering. He reached across the table and for the first time took her hand. It was cold and trembling. He wrapped his large, warm hands around it. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She spoke enough for the both of us. When she died, the silence in this house. It was a living thing. A monster. You came and the silence changed. It became peaceful." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am not angry, Arya. I am in awe of you. And I am so sorry for what you have endured. Your secret is safe here. This is your home. You don't ever have to be silent again, unless you want to be." Her composure finally shattered. A sob escaped her lips, then another. It was a raw, wrenching sound of years of pent-up fear and loneliness and pain pouring out of her. Johnny moved from his chair and knelt beside her, pulling her into an awkward, protective embrace. He held her as she wept, her small body shaking against his. He held her until the storm of tears subsided into quiet shudders. He had bought a deaf girl for $1, but he had just discovered he was living with one of the strongest women he had ever known. And in the breaking of her silence, the last of the ice around his own lonely heart began to melt away. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere on the Stone Ranch transformed. The truth, instead of driving them apart, had bound Johnny and Arya together in a new and profound intimacy. Arya began to speak more, her voice slowly losing its rusty edge, becoming clearer and softer. She would ask him about the cattle, about the seasons, about his past. She told him about her mother, about the songs she used to sing before she got sick. It was like discovering a whole new person. The silent, observant girl was still there, but now she had a voice, and with it came laughter. It was a sound Johnny hadn't realized how much his home was missing. It was a light, musical sound that seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of the house. He found himself intentionally saying things he thought she might find amusing, just to hear it. They worked side by side, their partnership no longer one of necessity, but of genuine companionship. They were two solitary souls who had found a haven in each other. The loneliness that had defined both of their lives was receding like a bad dream. But the past has a way of casting long shadows, and their peaceful existence was not destined to last. The trouble started, as it often did in redemption. Silas Blackwood had quickly drunk his way through the $1 Johnny had given him, and was back to being a town pariah. In one of his drunken ramblings at the saloon, trying to scrounge a free drink, he started boasting. "That Johnny Stone," he slurred to anyone who would listen. "Thinks he's so smart. Paid $1 for my deaf girl, a broken piece of goods. But I hear things. I hear she ain't so broken anymore. Talk is the girl's talkin' now. A miracle, they say." Most of the patrons ignored him, but one man did not. In a dark corner of the saloon sat Marcus Thorne, a man whose wealth was as vast as his morals were bankrupt. Thorne was not a rancher. He was a speculator. He bought land cheap from desperate homesteaders and sold it for a fortune to the railroad. He dressed in tailored suits from back east. His boots were always polished, and his face was clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the rugged men of the territory. He exuded an aura of predatory civility. Thorne's business was finding value where others saw none. And in a miraculously cured deaf girl, he smelled an opportunity. A story like that could be a gold mine. He could take her on a tour, exhibit her in halls from Denver to Chicago. People would pay a fortune to see the prairie miracle. She was a commodity. A few days later, Thorne rode out to the Stone Ranch in a fine black buggy. Johnny and Aria were in the corral working with a young colt when they saw the dust cloud approaching. Johnny's hand instinctively went to the pistol on his hip. Unsolicited visitors were rarely good news. Thorne pulled up and stepped down from his buggy, dusting off his coat with a gloved hand. He surveyed the ranch with a condescending air. "Johnny Stone," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Marcus Thorne. I believe we've seen each other in town." "I know who you are," Johnny said flatly, his body positioned slightly in front of Aria. Thorne's eyes flickered to Aria, a slick, appraising smile touching his lips. "And this must be the young lady who has caused such a stir. The miracle of redemption." He tipped his hat to her. "Miss Blackwood, it is a pleasure." Aria shrank back, slightly unnerved by the intensity of his gaze. "She's not Miss Blackwood. She's under my protection," Johnny said, his voice hard. "What do you want, Thorne? Straight to business." "I like that," Thorne chuckled. "I am a collector of rare and unique things, Mr. Stone. And your ward is just that. A girl deaf from birth who suddenly regains her hearing and voice on your ranch. It's a tale for the ages. A tale people will pay to hear." Johnny's blood ran cold. "She's not for sale." "Everything is for sale," Thorne countered smoothly. He pulled a thick wallet from his jacket. "I am prepared to offer you $500 for her. A significant return on your $1 investment, wouldn't you say?" The casual cruelty of his words, the way he reduced Aria to a financial transaction, ignited a cold fury in Johnny. "The answer is no. Get off my land." Thorne's smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned to chips of ice. "That is your final answer." "It is." "A pity," Thorne said, turning to leave. "A man must protect his investments. I always do." He climbed back into his buggy, and with a flick of the reins rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread in his wake. "Johnny, what does he want?" Aria asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing you need to worry about," Johnny said, though his gut told him otherwise. Marcus Thorne was not a man who took no for an answer. The threat didn't remain veiled for long. A week later, Johnny rode into Redemption for supplies, and found the atmosphere had changed. Old acquaintances wouldn't meet his eye. The blacksmith, a man named Peterson, whom Johnny had known for years, spoke to him in clipped, nervous tones. "You need to be careful, Johnny," Peterson muttered, pretending to be focused on shoeing a horse. "Thorne's been putting the word out. He's saying you're holding that girl against her will, that you're some kind of charlatan who's exploiting her." Johnny was stunned. Thorne was turning the town against him, poisoning his name. Worse, he was twisting the truth into a weapon. The following Sunday, as Johnny and Aria were loading the wagon to return from town, two of Thorne's hired men, burly, thuggish-looking men, accosted them in the street. "Thorne wants to see the girl," one of them growled, reaching for Aria's arm. Johnny moved faster than a striking snake. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with brutal force until the man yelped in pain. "Touch her, and you'll lose that hand." Johnny snarled, his eyes blazing. The second man went for his gun, but Johnny was already drawing his own. The cold, clear click of the hammer being cocked on his Colt Peacemaker stopped the man in his tracks. The street went dead silent. "Go back and tell your boss," Johnny said in a low, dangerous voice, "that this is his last warning. Stay away from my ranch. Stay away from her." The men backed away, their faces a mixture of fear and hatred. Johnny holstered his weapon and helped a shaken Aria into the wagon. As they rode out of town, he knew this was only the beginning. Thorne wouldn't use threats next time. He had tried to buy Aria. He had tried to slander Johnny. The next time, he would simply try to take her. The peaceful haven they had built was about to become a fortress under siege. The days following the confrontation in Redemption were taut with a suspense that felt like a physical presence on the ranch. Johnny became a man on watch. He slept little, his rifle always within arm's reach. Every gust of wind, every distant coyote howl sounded like an approaching threat. He moved their horses into the corral closest to the house and barred the barn door at night. Aria, too, felt the change. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined watchfulness. She proved to be as vigilant as he was, her senses honed by years of forced silence and observation were incredibly sharp. She noticed things he missed, a disturbed patch of grass on a faraway hill, the unusual quiet of the birds. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a partner in their defense. "He will come at night," she said one evening, her voice low as they sat in the dimly lit house. "He thinks the darkness is his friend." "Then we will be ready for him," Johnny replied, cleaning his rifle for the third time that week. The attack came 3 nights later under the sliver of a crescent moon. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick and heavy. Johnny was dozing in his armchair, a blanket over his lap and the rifle resting against the chair, when Aria touched his shoulder. Her touch was urgent. He was instantly awake. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't speak. She pointed towards the window, then cupped her hand to her ear. He strained to listen and heard it, the faint, unnatural crunch of boots on gravel, more than one set. They moved without a word. Johnny grabbed his rifle, and Aria took the shotgun he kept by the door. He had taught her how to use it, how to load it, how to brace for the powerful kick. Her face was pale in the moonlight filtering through the window, but her hands were steady. Johnny peered through a crack in the curtains. He could make out at least 4 figures moving stealthily toward the house, spreading out to surround it. Thorne wasn't with them. He was the kind of coward who paid others to do his dirty work. "Upstairs," Johnny whispered. "To the west window. Don't fire unless I do. Keep your head down." Aria nodded and slipped up the staircase like a ghost. A rough voice called out from the darkness. "Stone, we know you're in there. Thorne just wants the girl. Send her out and we'll leave you be." Johnny remained silent, moving to a window on the other side of the room. He could see two of the men trying to sneak toward the barn, likely to set a fire as a diversion. He rested his rifle on the windowsill, took a steadying breath, and aimed at the ground just in front of them. The rifle blast shattered the night silence. The bullet kicked up a shower of dirt, and the two men scrambled for cover with curses. "That was your only warning," Johnny yelled. "The next one won't miss." Answering shots erupted from the darkness. Wood splintered near the window, and Johnny ducked back. The siege had begun. For the next hour, a tense firefight ensued. Muzzle flashes lit up the night, followed by the roar of guns and the whine of ricocheting bullets. Johnny was a patient, methodical shooter, making every shot count, forcing Thorne's men to stay behind cover. From upstairs, Arya was a second pair of eyes. She would creep to a window, peer out, then hurry back to the top of the stairs and use their sign language, a language of the night now, to show him where the men were moving. Her silent reports were faster and safer than shouting. One of the thugs managed to get close to the porch on the blind side of the house. Johnny heard the wood creak and knew they were about to be breached. Before he could move, the deafening boom of the shotgun echoed from upstairs. A scream of pain followed from outside, then the sound of a man dragging himself away. Johnny looked up toward the top of the stairs, his heart swelling with a fierce pride. The fight seemed to reach a stalemate. The men were wary of Johnny's accuracy, and he couldn't risk leaving the house. Then he smelled it. Smoke. He looked out the back window and his blood ran cold. The men he'd driven from the barn had succeeded, after all. A sinister orange glow was growing from the barn, the dry hay inside catching fast. "They've fired the barn," he shouted. His livestock, his entire livelihood was in there. It was the choice Thorne wanted him to have to make his home or his future. If he ran to save the animals, the men would rush the house and take Arya. "Johnny, the horses!" Arya cried, her voice filled with anguish. He looked from the burning barn to her face, pale and smoke-stained in the flickering light. And in that moment, he knew there was no choice. The ranch, the cattle, the horses. It was all just wood and dirt and flesh. It could be replaced. She couldn't. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice firm. "Nothing out there matters." But Arya shook her head, a desperate, cunning light in her eyes. "Go," she said. "I have an idea. Create a diversion. Draw them to the front." Trusting the look on her face, Johnny nodded. He went to the front door, took a deep breath, and kicked it open, firing 2 quick shots into the darkness to draw their attention. As the remaining thugs returned fire on the front of the house, Arya slipped out the back door, melting into the smoke and shadows. Johnny held them off for a crucial minute, his mind screaming with worry. What was her plan? Then from the direction of the woodpile behind the house came a woman's terrified scream, followed by a series of crashing sounds. "She's out back! She's trying to run for it!" one of the men yelled. The remaining 2 thugs, believing their prize was escaping, abandoned their siege of the house and sprinted around the back toward the sounds. Johnny followed, his rifle ready. He rounded the corner just in time to see the conclusion of Arya's brilliant, desperate plan. She had created the noise by toppling a stack of firewood. As the men rushed past the narrow gap between the smokehouse and the main house, a thick rope tied between the 2 buildings was suddenly pulled taut, about shin height. The men, running blindly in the dark, hit the rope and went down in a tangled, cursing heap. Before they could recover, Arya, who had been hiding in the deep shadows of the smokehouse, brought a heavy cast-iron skillet down on one man's head with all her might. He went limp. The second man scrambled to his knees, but Johnny was on him, the butt of his rifle striking the man squarely in the jaw. He crumpled to the ground. The sudden silence was broken only by the roar of the fire from the barn and their own ragged breathing. It was over. Johnny rushed to Arya, checking her for injuries. She was trembling, her knuckles white, where she gripped the skillet, but she was unharmed. "You were incredible," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the tragic flames of their burning barn. "You said we would be ready for him," she replied, a small, defiant smile on her lips. "I was ready." As they watched the barn burn, knowing Thorne's men were defeated. For the night they stood not as a rancher and his ward, but as equals, as partners who had faced down the darkness and won. They had lost the barn, but they had protected their home, and they had done it together. The dawn that followed the attack was somber and grey. A cool rain began to fall, hissing as it met the smouldering ruins of the barn. The fire was out, but the cost of their victory was a blackened skeleton of timber that stained the morning sky. Exhausted but resolute, Johnny and Arya worked in the drizzle, their movements synchronized in a silent understanding. They had already tied up Thorne's unconscious men, leaving them for the law. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond between them stronger than any steel. Marshal Thompson arrived late that morning, his weary face grim as he took in the scene. He listened to Johnny's account, looked at the trussed-up thugs, and nodded slowly. "Marcus Thorne has bought his way out of trouble for years," the marshal said, his voice hard. "But this is attempted murder. He's gone too far. I can finally hold him." He tipped his hat with a newfound respect for them both. "You did well to hold them off. Real well." As the marshal and his deputies loaded the thugs into a wagon and departed for redemption, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The immediate threat was gone. Johnny and Arya stood together on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the muddy road. The rain had softened to a mist, washing the soot from the air and leaving the world feeling clean and new. Before them lay the ruin of a building, but also the promise of a future free from fear. "What will we do now?" Arya asked softly, her gaze fixed on the wreckage. "We'll rebuild," Johnny said, without a moment's hesitation, his voice firm. "Stronger this time." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. They were smudged with soot and calloused from her work, and they were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "Arya," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "When I brought you here, this place was just land and buildings. I was just existing. But you made it a home. You filled the silence first with your presence, and then with your voice, with your laughter." Her eyes glistened, reflecting the overcast sky as she listened. "I didn't pay $1 for a housekeeper." He continued, his voice low and earnest. "I think I was paying for a chance at a life I thought I'd lost forever. What I feel for you has nothing to do with pity or protection. I admire you more than anyone I have ever known. Your strength, your heart, your courage." He took a deep breath, his gaze locked with hers. "I love you, Arya. I love you, not in spite of everything you've been through, but because of it. It made you who you are." A single tear escaped and traced a clean path down her cheek. "I never thought anyone could truly see me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For so long I just wanted to be invisible. But you saw me even when I was silent. You listened to me even when I had no voice." She squeezed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "I love you, Johnny. You gave me a home when all I had was a prison." Johnny's heart, a fortress for so long, felt as if it would burst. He lifted a hand and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Then I have one more thing to ask. I don't want to be your guardian anymore," he said. "I want to be your husband. I want to build our life here together. I want to wake up every morning to the sound of your voice and rebuild that barn With you. Not for you. Her answer wasn't a word, but a radiant, tearful smile that lit up her entire face, chasing away the greyness of the day. She threw her arms around his neck and pulled him close, her answer, a clear and joyous yes. Spoken not with her voice, but with the full force of her heart. He held her tightly, the smell of rain and wood smoke in the air. He had bought her for a single silver dollar, a transaction of desperation in the dust of a cruel town. But here on the porch of their home, he knew the truth. She was not a purchase. She was a gift. Their life together would be a testament to the fact that the most valuable things, courage, love, and a shared future, could never be bought, only earned. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely, and the silent girl had found her voice and her home. From a single silver dollar exchanged in the dust, a story of incredible resilience and unexpected love was born. Johnny thought he was rescuing a fragile, silent girl, but in truth, he was finding the missing piece of his own soul. Arya's silence was not a weakness, but a shield, and her voice, when she finally chose to use it, had the power to save a life, defend a home, and awaken a hardened heart. Their journey reminds us that true strength isn't about being unbreakable, but about finding the courage to heal, to trust, and to speak your truth, even when the world has tried to silence you. It's a story of how two broken people in the harshest of landscapes could rebuild a life far stronger and more beautiful than anything that was lost. If their story of resilience and love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this tale of the Wild West with someone who loves a story of the human spirit's triumph. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life and remind us of the timeless power of hope and connection.